That was lovely. Thank you all. And thanks to Paul for that message about the sabbatical. Now I'm all excited. I didn't know that was one of the purposes, but no, I did. I wasn't prepared for what he was talking about, so I was kind of excited by what he was saying. And it's true that you do get to rest your spirit and come up with new ideas, worship at different churches and see what they're doing, and come back with new ideas, a full spirit. And a lot of people don't know that ministers seldom get to worship. I mean, you don't think about it necessarily, but get to worship at other places and get to experience different styles of preaching and different types of worship and get to see what things are going on other places, and then get to come back with all kinds of wild and crazy ideas. So I can see you all are terribly excited about that. So this morning, I'm going to preach on a parable, and this parable is brought to you by the letter P. This parable is actually quite funny, and it is a parable that I'm going to be reading for our scripture lesson today in Sesame Street style. I have recruited helpers who are going to help me present the parable this morning. It's from Luke 18, 1-8. So Jesus told them a parable showing that it was necessary for them to pray consistently and never to quit. He said there was a judge in some city who never gave God a second thought and cared nothing for the people. A woman, a widow in that city, pestered him. "My rights are being violated. Protect me." But the judge never gave her the time of day. He put her off at every turn. After this went on and on and on, he said to himself, "I care nothing of what God thinks, and even less what people think. But because this widow won't quit pestering me, I'd better do something and see that she gets justice. Otherwise, I'm going to end up beaten black and blue from her pounding." And then the master said, "Do you hear what the judge, corrupt as he is saying? So what makes you think God won't step in and provide justice for God's chosen people who continue to cry out for help? Won't God stick up for them? I assure you God will. God's feet won't drag. But how much of that kind of persistent faith will the Son of Man find on earth when he returns?" Oh, they fell. Okay. Thank you. Thank you to my helpers. Now, the reason we did this in Sesame Street form is because Luke, the gospel writer, actually intended for us to laugh at this parable. He actually sets it up like a melodrama with overly obvious characters doing laughable things. Can't you just picture this pesky widow standing before the judge, refusing to leave him alone until he gives her justice? And can't you just hear the inner dialogue of the judge thinking to himself, "What do I have to do to give this obnoxious woman justice, to get her out of my courtroom?" Now, Barbara Brown Taylor, who is an amazing preacher, writes about this parable, and I'm drawing extensively from her work for this sermon. She says it succinctly This is one of the funniest stories in the entire Bible. That is until you realize that the story is actually about prayer. Apparently, we're supposed to make pests of ourselves in hopes that God will respond to us only if it is to get us to shut up. Now, what you need to realize is that this parable follows a very scary story about the end of time. In the first story, Jesus tells his disciples, on the night before the end of time, there will be two in a bed. One will be taken, and the other will be left. There will be two women grinding grain together. One will be taken, and the other left. Then Jesus takes a quick breath and continues with this parable about the unjust judge. This is our clue that Jesus is not just talking about any kind of prayer. He's talking about the kind of prayer that asks God to get busy and get busy now. The kind of prayer that demands a response from God. The kind of prayer that begs for God's presence. The kind of prayer that is a frustrated cry for justice. The kind of prayer that pleads God for compassion. The kind of prayer that requires God's action and now. As some of you know, prayer like that, it can wear your heart right out. And if you're not careful, especially when there is absolutely no sign on earth that God has heard, much less answered your prayer. This week, we were talking about the prayers of African Americans, especially in the trial of Derek Chauvin's case, about increasing violence against them. We're talking about the prayers of the parents whose children are missing. We're talking about the prayers of people suffering with terminal illness or hunger. These are the kinds of prayers we're talking about. And you can only knock so long at a closed door before your heart and your hands hurt so much that you don't know how long you can go on. You can only listen so long into the silence before you start to wonder if anyone was ever there. When that happens, when the pain and the doubt gang up on you to the point that you start feeling dead inside, then it's time to get some help. Because in Jesus' words, you're losing heart. And Jesus doesn't want you. Jesus doesn't want that to happen to anyone he loves. And that's why he told his disciples this parable about praying persistently and not losing heart, like the woman who went to pester the judge. Perhaps he told his disciples this because things weren't going well for them or him. The disciples wanted God to make it clear to everyone that Jesus was who they thought he was. But instead, there were warrants out for his arrest, and even he was telling them that his place at the table would soon be empty. That's not what they wanted to hear. And by the time Luke wrote it all down some 20 years later, things had gotten even worse. Rome was standing over Jerusalem like a vulture over a corpse, and there was no sign that it was going to get better. Jesus had told them he would be right back, only he wasn't right back. People were losing heart. So Luke repeated the story that Jesus had told about this wronged widow who would not stop pleading her case. And Luke did not say what her complaint was about, but it's not really hard to guess, because she was a woman in first century Jerusalem, and her case probably concerned her dead husband's estate. Now, you see, under Jewish law, she couldn't inherit her dead husband's estate. It went straight to her son or her brother-in-law. So the fact that she was standing alone in front of the judge is a good indicator that none of the men in her family were on her side. She was likely a woman thrown onto the streets with no means of support, no place to go, and no one to care for her. That was normal in their society. As it turned out, she was quite capable of caring for herself. But this was not a respectable judge. And by his own admission, he had no fear of God and no respect for anyone. He declared that God did not have authority over him and that the people did not get to him. But somehow, this pesky woman did get to him. Now, we can't hear the humor in the English translation, but in the Lucan Greek version, the judge uses a boxing term for this woman. A boxing term. Any boxers here? Nobody. Okay. Well, any Greek boxers here? Any ancient Greek boxers here? Probably not. So I'll tell you what the Greek says here in ancient Greek boxing terms, although I don't know that either. But my Greek commentary tells me that the judge said, "Yet because this woman keeps pestering me, I will grant her justice so that she may not wear me out with continued blows to my face." It's a Greek humor. This boxing, she's boxing him continually with blows to the face. And listen to what the unjust judge says. Jesus says to his disciples, and this is the part he wants us to hear. Won't God do the same for you? If you cry out both day and night, will God delay long in helping you? That's what Jesus wants us to hear in the parable. Now, let's switch our focus for a moment to the woman. When she found herself all alone without anyone to help her, she had a few choices. She could sit down and cry, which is what we're tempted to do. Or she could become a complainer and drive away what little friends she had. Or she could just hide and keep her suffering to herself. These are, by the way, some of the choices we've had during the pandemic. You know, sit down and cry, become a complainer and drive away our friends, and hide and keep suffering to ourselves. Or, one of the last options, she could pursue justice and be relentless, as if her life depended on it. She knew what she wanted, and she knew who could give it to her, and whether she did it or not was beyond her control, but that didn't matter to her. She was willing to say what she wanted out loud, day and night, over and over, whether she got it or not. And I'm certain there were no words for her relief when she finally threw off her shame, her caution, her self-control, and she went directly to her source to say exactly what she wanted. She did not know she could roar until she heard herself do it. "Give me justice," she yelled at the judge. "Do your job. Answer me now or answer me later, but I'm coming back to pester you every day, every night, forever, until you deal with me." So he dealt with her, and they all lived happily ever after. No, there's a little ending to this parable we'd all like to jump over. It's a question, as Jesus paused it. He says, "And yet, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?" It makes you think that Jesus did not know how many persistent widows there would be, or that he thought there weren't enough of us. He didn't know very many people with the faith to stay at something long enough. Because then, as now, most people prayed like we brush our teeth. Once in the morning, and sometimes at night. And even the ones who prayed for a little while, like they meant it, backed off when they felt their prayers were unanswered. Do not ask, and you will not be disappointed. Do not seek, and you will not miss what you did not find. And as far as that growing deadness in your gut that you feel where your heart used to be, well, you just have to get used to that. What the persistent widow knew that was the most important time to pray is when your prayers seem meaningless. That's the most important time to pray. When they seem meaningless. She was willing to trust the process, regardless of the outcome, because the process itself gave her life purpose. And the process kept her engaged with what mattered most so that she didn't lose heart. Have you ever been without a job and you went to an interview and you didn't get the job, but having the interview gave you purpose? And then you got another interview and you didn't get that job, but dressing up and going to the interview gave you a week or two full of purpose? And finally, after 5 interviews and no result, you at least had 5 weeks of purpose? Sometimes the process is the purpose. And finally, you get the right job. It's like so many people of color waiting this week in the street for a verdict, waiting so many years with hope to hear, waiting to hear a guilty after so many times when the verdict was innocent. Afraid to hope, and yes, holding on to hope that justice might be served this time. If it were, perhaps they thought it would send a critical message this time that there is a consequence for blatant murder. They were praying in the streets. Persistence. It's like in our own community, you know him, Bo Schumacher. Year after year, each time his daughter's murderers are up for parole, going to court again and again to make certain that they are not released, so that they have no option of harming another child. It's like so many parents and family members searching for their missing child after years with no answers. Persistence, prayers. It's like our Armenian friends. They were here a year and a half ago at UCC, sitting together, aching now over the regular assaults from neighboring countries, slaughtering their innocent young, genocide and upheaval in their small country over the decades. Persistent prayers for them. Most of our prayers are not for genocide, murder, but they matter to us. When people ask if prayer works, tell them the story. Tell them the story of the widow and the unjust judge. Prayer keeps our hearts chasing after God's own heart. And prayer is how we bother God. And it's how God bothers us back. And there's nothing that works any better than that. So keep bothering God day and night, because justice will come. It will come. It will come. Amen.